Mother's eyes, they know about what it more we watch the clouds to see a child playing there, scraped up knees and tangled hair, but no mouse that's safe no more. These weary waves will break the shore. The angry man will stop to rest, and we will die on Sunday's best. And from the ground wash the sun, and just one more. Around the sleeping giant there, where he will learn how to play fair.
clarify, I've actually never done LSD, so I wouldn't know. But I've done research. Depending on the dose that the person takes, it can be an incredibly intense experience. Some people have a great time on LSD, other people are traumatized for life and their lives change forever, even after just one single usage. Around 4% of users will unfortunately experience hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, or HPPD, which is where they will continue to experience these visual distortions or hallucinations for months or even years
last person I would trust for like a medical recommendation for a friend of his after what he did to all his employees. But regardless, Frank did trust Mr. Gottlieb, and so the night before he went away to the hospital, he was telling his family that he really was hopeful about this. He was excited to go back to a normal life once treatment was over. So Frank Olson gets to New York and he checks into a hotel, and then he sees a psychiatrist where he tells them kind of everything that he's struggling with at the moment. He said that since ingesting the LSD, he had felt permanently confused. He was forgetting how to do normal tasks. He was forgetting people's names. He was forgetting who people were. It felt as though half of his brain was wiped, and now the other half was trying to make sense of life without the other information. The doctor assured him that they could work on these things together and that treatment and cure was possible. And so the conversation ended on a high. But that very same night that Frank arrived in New York for his treatment, he tragically died of a suicide. He threw himself out of a 13th floor window in that hotel and died on impact. And everyone just accepted that ruling because, of course, Frank had been under such mental distress for so long. He had desperately been trying to find a way to stop it all. So maybe it had all just got too much for him, and his family accepted that. But 22 years later, Frank Olson's case was covered by the Washington Post, and they really dug into it, and they didn't believe that it was a suicide. They didn't propose any specific theory, but just not suicide was their theory. And as more people were reading this article from the Washington Post, a lot more people were rallying behind this and saying, no, that doesn't sound right, it doesn't sound like a suicide. I mean, the obvious other theory is that it was murder, but why? And who? People have theorized that maybe it was all like a bit of a big cover-up. Maybe Frank Olson was killed to silence him. Maybe he was going to speak out about the LSD experiments. Or maybe it didn't look good for the LSD experiments that people were having bad reactions. So maybe he was intentionally gotten rid of to, I don't know, skew the results and make it look like LSD is this wonder drug that never has any issues. And I think it's really interesting when you remember that Frank actually told Sidney Gottlieb that he was thinking about leaving his job after he was spiked. So maybe, I don't know, maybe it all kind of has, maybe it's all linked. Maybe they were worried that he was going to become a whistleblower and they needed to get rid of him. Anyway, Frank Olson's family began the process of trying to sue the CIA for Frank's suspicious death. They were eventually offered $750,000 as a settlement, and they took it. But they still had a lot of questions, unanswered questions, and they asked if they could speak with Sidney Gottlieb himself. Just want to remind you that this is 22 years after Frank's death. So Sidney Gottlieb is an old man at this point. Frank's family, Frank's kids are all grown up. When they first arrived at this meeting, Gottlieb looked up at them and sighed with relief, saying, "I'm so happy you don't have a weapon. I had a dream last night that you all arrived at this door and shot me." It was an interesting way to look at it. Also, the fact that he's having those kind of dreams is that he feels confident. Frank's son believes that in retrospect, when he thinks about the meeting with Dr. Gottlieb, he thinks that he was being very manipulative and victimizing himself. Frank's son said that before we even got through the door, we were apologizing to him and we were ignoring him. For the rest of the meeting, I think everything was kind of normal. Gottlieb answered any questions that the family had, but at one point, he turned to Frank's son and said, "Your father and I were very much alike. We both got into this because of patriotic feeling, but we both went a little too far. We did things that we probably shouldn't have done." And that was about as close to a confession as Sidney Gottlieb ever got when he was Frank Olson. Very vague, very disturbing. Over a decade later, after that, Frank's son still wasn't convinced with everything. He just had a lot of unanswered questions that always really played on his mind. And so example, there were no shards of glass or splinters or anything found on him. And I know that he has confirmed at this point, but surely the glass is kind of land on him. It would still be there, surely glass doesn't decompose. And this was a man that supposedly dove headfirst out of a 13th floor window. Now, I don't know if reports at the time said that he smashed through the glass and that's why they were specifically looking for glass. I don't know, when I hear about someone jumping from a height, I think that people but for some reason that was evidence for them that he didn't jump. But I think what's even bigger evidence that it wasn't a suicide was that on his skull they found an injury, like a bit to the left eye. Part of his skull was cracked. Now, when Frank Olsen jumped and was found, his family were told that he was laying on his back. He left it on his back, and yes, there was a lot of damage to the back of his skull. But why is there one big injury above his eye? The pathologist believed that this was potentially evidence that Frank was struck with a weapon or pushed or fell or jumped out of that window. Something happened to him first, basically. So this could well be proof that someone was violent to Frank in his final moments before he ended up throwing out of the window. But I think it's really interesting that this front of the head injury was never acknowledged. His family were never told about it, it was never explained. No one even knew that it happened until they saw his skull 30 years later. I just find that very interesting. Is that proof of a cover-up? How is that not explained? I guess we'll never really know the full truth of Frank Olsen's death, but the fact of the matter is, he was spiked with LSD by his boss without his consent for the sake of research, and then he eventually ended up losing his life as a consequence of that spiking. So indirectly, he lost his life because of MK Ultra. Frank also was completely blindsided by the experimentation done on him, but there were a lot of MK Ultra test subjects that actually volunteered. Or, well, they didn't know that they were volunteering for mind control experiments. Let me clarify that. But they would think that they were volunteering and consenting for just regular old, psychological clinical studies, which are perfectly fine. And they still happen today. Human experimentation is fine if it's safe and legal and people are fully consenting and it's all, if it's done right, then it's fine. But back then it wasn't, and getting fully informed consent wasn't necessary back then, so they were allowed to lie to their test subjects. They would tell them that the study was for one thing, something quite irrelevant, would be like looking into people's mental health, and so people would be like, wow, yeah, I want to help with research into mental health issues. They would sign their name up, bam, they're part of their field now, and they had no idea. And they volunteered it. They signed their name up to be experimented on, but they didn't know.
It's a lie.
There were a lot of MK Ultra experiments and operations that would go on inside prisons, and a lot of those would be on a voluntary basis. If prisoners signed up to be a part of the study, then they would often get reduced sentences or benefits. I don't know. But they would do it for a reason, basically. They had an incentive to want to sign up for these studies. So prisons was one of the best ways for MK Ultra to operate, because they had people practically throwing themselves at them to be tested on. One of these prison experiment study things that they did, they told these prisoners that they were looking to find a cure for schizophrenia. So about 19 inmates volunteered from this one particular prison in Atlanta. And one of these inmates was a man named Whitey Bulger. Now, you might have heard of him. I personally had never heard of him, but I am from England. I am from the UK. But apparently, he used to be one of the most feared mob bosses in the whole of Boston. Oh wait, this was in the 1950s. Whitey Bulger was 27 years old when he was locked up in 1956 in Atlanta, and he signed up for this schizophrenia curing trial thinking that he was doing a good deed for humanity. Little did he know, he had just become a part of inhalation. For the next year of his life, a whole year, Whitey and all of his mates would be subjected to doses of every single day. That sounds absolutely heinous. To subject someone to over a year of their life, that puts someone in a state of surely. We were talking about how that's practically what was it. But this was very early on in all of the LSD testing. The experiment began which is exactly actually why they they were to fuck up a bunch of prisoners' brains. Who cares? I would like to clarify that I care. I was just saying that from POV science. Anyway, Whitey Bulger Whitey is not his like real first name. In fact, his name is James Bulger, which is exactly why I keep calling him Whitey. That was his nickname that everyone called him with, but James Bulger. I read that and I was like, wrong kid. But Whitey described this period of his life while he was being experimented on as a living nightmare that took him to the depths of insanity. He started taking voices, he became an anxious wreck. It really, really brought him down mentally. And one of his delusions was that if he spoke a word of any of this, like, pain that he was feeling, if he spoke a word of that to anyone else, then it would be a trap. The LSD had made him think that he had to just suffer through all of this. He couldn't tell anyone, otherwise something horrible would happen. I think one of the things that he was worried about as well was being sent to a psychiatric unit, which were notoriously abusive back then in like the 1950s. They should be horrible to patients. Mental patients were treated worse than prisoners. So he would rather be in prison than have people think that he was crazy and get sent to an aside. So for that reason, he kept all of his suffering to himself and endured the whole year-long experiment. Years later, when the experiment had ended and Whitey Bulger was released from prison, he went on to become a serial killer. Not necessarily like a coldly calculated, premeditated serial killer like the ones we go around with the channel, but he became a notorious monster. Well, he already was before he went in prison, wasn't he? But as part of that, he began murdering his ops, murdering people that he thought were snitches, just murdering. That was how he was solving his problems after being in prison. Of course, he was eventually imprisoned later in his life when he was caught for all these murders, and he blamed MK Ultra for that sudden, violent phase of his. He said that they made him a very angry and violent man. He had a lot of just anger and hatred inside of him that was actually towards all of the experimenters in the first place, but he'd been harbouring it for so long that this is how it ended up coming out. He said that he doesn't think he would have killed that many people had he not been subjected to horrific experiments. In fact, I have a quote from him here, which I think is so eloquent. Look, he said, I was in prison for committing a crime, which they committed it later. But Whitey wasn't the only MK Ultra test subject that went on to commit heinous crimes afterwards. Would you believe me if I told you the Unabomber was tested on as part of MK Ultra, obviously before he became the Unabomber? Ted Kaczynski is his full name if you didn't know, and when he was 16 years old, he enrolled in Harvard University. He was a very intelligent person.
Be part of the fast-growing neighborhood.
Yeah, he was in university at the age of 60. And it was while he was there at Harvard, when he was so young, he was experimented on in substances. And this is going to annoy you all, as it did me, but we don't know what he did to later on in life, he goes on to become the Unabomber. He killed 3 people and injured 23 more with like 4 big nail guns. So that's 2 MK Ultra test subjects that went on to become serial killers, which I know is not a huge number. It's like that Dr. Dickinson thing, isn't it? Where he's like, if I had a nickel for every time this happened, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot. It's weird that it happened twice, right? I just thought it was quite interesting happening when I found out about that, because I found out about the Unabomber being involved in all of this right at the very end of my research, and I was like, hold the phone, guys, we have a really important last-minute entry. I couldn't believe it. You would think that would take a toll on that person for the rest of their life, especially if they were finding LSD. So you really don't know what that could alter in their brain. And now I want to tell you about probably the most evil scientist in the whole of MK Ultra, Dr. Cameron. He has become infamous for his experiments that were specifically on mental patients, literal mental patients that he was treating in hospital because he was a doctor. He would experiment on his own patients that trusted him, that came to him for help, for a cure. He was a lot of Dr. Cameron's work was purely experimental. He is exactly the analogy that I used earlier about giving a kid every toy in the world. That was Dr. Cameron. He had a hospital, he had patients, he was just doing whatever he wanted. A lot of his experimental treatments included LSD, but they went way beyond that. Like, they could be considered physical. He was very fond of electroshock therapy on his patients. He also did what he would call the sleep room, which is not a magical relaxing fairy tale place like it sounds. It was essentially a big room with patients in hospital beds, all of them in medically induced comas. He would just put people into comas, sometimes for months at a time. People would come to him saying, I'm really struggling, I really need help. He would go, okay, put to sleep for 2 months. Why? What does that do? He would also use sensory deprivation tanks with his treatment a lot, which, if you don't know what a sensory deprivation tank is, it's like a little pool of water that's human-sized, and you get in and basically float on this water. Your eyes are covered, your ears are covered, and the lid comes down so it's completely dark in there. Basically, the idea is that it blocks off all of your senses. Sensory deprivation. See, hear, smell, taste, touch, and this is supposed to be quite therapeutic. I've seen it offered in like some spas.
He's like a little old man.
The most I know about sensory deprivation tanks is 11 from Stranger Things, which is actually based on MK Ultra. Can you believe it? But yeah, it's supposed to be quite a relaxing thing. There's a reason that people pay for sensory deprivation sessions, and I don't know what that reason is. I've never done it myself. But Dr. Cameron would not make this process relaxing at all. The patient's hands would be tied for whatever reason, and then they would be subjected to stressing stimuli, which is very vague. I don't know what it means, but it sounds horrible. And a lot of the time they would be on LSD, which sounds even more terrifying. Often the doctors that would supervise these sensory deprivation experiments would have to stop the subject from screaming because what was going on in the tank was so uncomfortable. And I wish I knew what stressing stimuli meant, because what the fuck are you doing to the people in the little tank? People that underwent this sensory deprivation treatment long term, if they had multiple sessions of it for months, then it would really, really affect them. They would be a shell of themselves afterwards. A lot of the time, they would kind of be stripped back to a childlike state. They would be very dependent on hospital staff. Sometimes they would be incontinent, so they'd be wearing nappies. They would need feeding by the staff. They would forget who they were. They would forget about their life. They'd become very anxious. It sounds horrid, but all of this was in the name of de-patterning his patients. That's what Dr. Cameron called it, a de-patterning process. which is kind of what we were talking about in the start of the video. It's essentially the process of breaking down the existing mental patterns, thoughts and beliefs that someone has, breaking down their existing mind. The idea was that they would wipe the slate completely clean so then they could rebuild this person's mind from the beginning. That way it can be built up with new thoughts and beliefs and ideas, healthier ones, happier ones than the thoughts that they were having before. Remember, this is supposed to be a mental health treatment, so the idea, like in theory, that sounds great, but in practice, it's fucking atrocious. In theory, if this process was tested and proven, then it sounds like a miracle cure. But that's the problem. It wasn't tested, it had never been tested. So therefore it hadn't been proven. But Dr. Cameron didn't give a shit. He was just completely freeballing. He would get a patient in and just like improvise and be like, so what do I want to do today? How do I want to break their mind down today? How am I going to try it? And he did use a few different methods, warning, all of which are brutal. There was one thing that he would do called psychic driving, which is where he would send his patient for a psychiatric assessment and they would really find out like their pressure points, their trigger points, what really. The psychiatric assessment where they're figuring all this out would be audio recorded, and then the scientist would go back through this recording and pick out clips of like especially triggering parts, like really triggering sentences, and they would play them back for their patient, but not just once, not just twice, they would put it on repeat in their for 20 hours a day. Every single day that they were in hospital for 20 hours, they would hear their own voice talking about their biggest triggers just over and over again. I don't know if the aim was to like desensitize them to it or what, but it ended up just traumatizing people even more. The things would be saying like, everyone hates you, or like, your mum's disappointed in you, like horrible, horrible things. Not things that you're gonna start to grow with thick skin. These messages would be played over like speakers and the top like tannoy speakers. They gave patients like a helmet, like a sports helmet, with a speaker inside. So instead of headphones, I guess maybe headphones weren't a thing in the 90s. Eh? I just googled when were headphones invented. 1891? Oh, they didn't become popular until 1979 though, so it makes sense. They didn't have headphones, so they made a weird helmet with a speaker inside. So it would be going over the room, it would be in this helmet, and they would even build in a little speaker into their pillow, so they couldn't even get away from it. So that was psychic driving. Now let's talk about the sleep thing that I mentioned earlier, of medically induced causes all around. Again, I don't really understand the intention of this treatment. I don't understand where they were going with a lot of MK Ultra or whatever. Dr. Cameron would put his patients into a medically induced coma. They would be awoken about 3 times a day for bathroom breaks. And he had this one patient called Esther Schreier, who I did quite a bit of research on actually, because she's been very vocal about her family have been very vocal about what she went through. Esther arrived at the hospital one day saying that she was really, really down. She was really struggling with her mental health. A couple of years before this, she had lost her child. She'd given birth to a baby and it died within like 2 months. And then very recently, she'd had another child successfully, and that child was alive, but she was really, really struggling with postnatal depression now. And so she came to this hospital begging Dr. Cameron to help her. And so he said, okay, I prescribe you 30 days in the sleep room. 30 days in a fucking coma. For what? This was one of the longest stints that they had ever attempted with the sleep room. And by the end of it, Esther was totally broken down. She lost 12 pounds over that month because obviously physical exercise, eating as much and stuff. And is long gone, but her son Lloyd is in his 60s, and he is still fighting to be recognised as a victim of Ultra's experimentation. I think he's not officially considered to be a victim of all of this because he's still inside his experience and like specifically him that was experimented on, but it definitely did affect his development. He was slower than like the kids his age. I mean, it didn't affect him too much more than that, but he was just slower developmentally. These days, he's fully grown up, fully independent, he's fine. He's like living a good life, he's successful. But he is a very rare case, and I mean, that could have gone so differently. They don't know what electric shocking pregnant ladies can do to a baby going inside her. It could kill them. A lot of Dr. Cameron's patients meet similar things. They charged them with care like a zombie, so much worse than they originally came in. And that's awful enough what was happening to these individuals. But when you think about the knock-on effect that all of these experiments had, people lost their jobs because they couldn't work anymore because they were zombie, so they couldn't provide for their families anymore. Parents couldn't look after their children anymore, so they were taken away and put into care. Families were just completely torn apart. There were so many terrible consequences of everything beyond just the violation of the experiment itself. The suffering that came out of it all affected human creation. And I can't believe it was able to go on for so long. For 20 years, they were secretly experimenting on humans and no one had any idea. Finally, it did all come to an end in 1973. The director of the CIA at the time, his name was Richard Knox, he was literally fired by President Nixon because he deemed to be disloyal. I wonder what the drama is there. I didn't actually look into that. I thought it was like a secret thing. Now I want to know about the president drama. But anyway, director of the CIA is now fired. That was Dr. Cindy Gottlieb's boss. And they were like besties. They were partners. They were like mates. If you're an audio listener, I've got my fingers crossed right now. They were when Helms got fired, he and Gottlieb decided that the best thing to do for MK Ultra was to shut it all down. But not just stop, not just seize operations. They wanted to destroy as much documentation of MK Ultra as they possibly could. Perhaps they knew that they could potentially get someone much less corrupt than them came across these documents, then maybe they'd be in a world of trouble. So Dr. Gottlieb drove out to the CIA Records Center and he ordered those boxes and boxes and boxes full of MK Ultra archive to be destroyed. This was tragically successful. Most of it was destroyed. Some documentation did survive, and that's how we know what we know. But there was so much more, and it really irritates me that we're never going to know the full extent of the horrors of MK Ultra. It's impossible for us to know how many people died directly or indirectly because of MK Ultra, or how many lives were destroyed because of it. And in the end, they didn't even find a mind control drug. They just dosed loads of people on LSD for 20 years, and that was it. But yeah, that is all I have for this episode of Freaky Friday. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks again to Opera for sponsoring this video. Remember, you can download it using the link down below in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please give a thumbs up or comment or interact with it in some way. If you engage with the video, then YouTube tends to push it out more, and me and the whole team would be super grateful. We're really excited about Freaky Friday, and I know I say that in every episode, but that's because we're really excited about Freaky Friday, alright? But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week for a true crime episode. Bye!